call the, what is it, May 19th, 2022 meeting of LUAC to order. Since we don't have a quorum, we can't do the minutes or officially approve the agenda, but we'll just go with the agenda as it is. Try to get a little bit of work done here. So,
Thank
your
you.
thing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Lisa Barajas, the Executive Director of Community Development. I'm going to open this presentation, turn it over to Michael after that, but we really want to give you an overview. I don't know that we've been all that specific to LUAC. Wendy, our council member, Wolf, has heard some of this before, but for everyone else, we want to be sure you have this on the ground before we dig into this work. And certainly, you've heard from Raya and the team about community designations and some of our foundational work that we've done in the past. But I really want to put this package around all of this work as being part of the 2050 Regional Development Guide work. So doing that next decade's worth of work. And today we'll focus specifically on vision, values, and goals, especially the vision pieces and the values pieces as a way to really direct and guide the work that we're going to be doing over the next couple of years, not just in this organization, but with our partners across the region and residents in the region of building our next regional plan. So why do we do this? I think committee member Drosty has seen me present this slide in various forms before too, just with different colors. But really their legislation really lays out the purpose for regional planning, that we are interdependent communities in this region, and that actions by individual communities have an impact on the region's infrastructure. That growth within the region does create a need for additional public services. And when this was written in the Land Planning Act in 1976, there was the legislative purpose was around this increased risk of air and water pollution and water supply shortages, which continues to be an issue that we deal with today in the region, just in sort of a different format and in different ways of where those pollutants are coming from, and certainly with water supply shortages related to that as well. But for all of those reasons, the legislature determined that regional planning was necessary. Gary, come on in order to support and ensure, yep, anywhere you like, the coordinated, orderly, and economical development of the region, and that base level for, I think, all of our government agencies, local to state, for protecting public health, safety, and welfare. So very specifically, the statute does say that we shall provide and prepare a comprehensive development guide for the metropolitan area. That's our directive at the council. And further, that it shall consist of all these policy statements that in green I want to highlight that really are prescribing these guides for orderly and economical development of the area, of the entire region. So really focusing on that as being important and land use being a primary component of that development. And then further, the highlighted words in blue, I wanted to just note in the statute as well that we are to include all of these things, including land use, which you see first and foremost, but also parks and open space, things like airports, highways, transit, public hospitals, libraries, schools, all of these public facilities that would have an impact on the region. But not limited to these matters, but just the matters that were identified at that time. So like any planning process, we always start with where we are today. What is our baseline? I think you've covered some of these report outs here at LUAC, as well as I know at the council. Our staff have provided a whole lot of comp plan composite. What our local plan's saying now is that creates our baseline for future planning work. And even work within our committees, transportation committee around COVID impacts on travel behavior, economic impacts in the region that we're experiencing right now due to COVID, and so many other types of things, really grounding of where we are today, what the issues we're facing. And then we'll be turning to where do we want to go in light of all of those challenges, and in addition to some of the conversations we're going to begin to have now around what is our vision for that, and then the detailed work of how do we want to get there, and what are the strategies or actions we want to use to get there. So I'm very happy to turn it over to Mike to dig into that.
Thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon, LUAC members. It's good to see you in person, if only a few of you. I'm sure we'll be back before you again in the future too to update you and get further input. Again, I'm Michael Larson. I'm a planning analyst in the local planning assistance group in the Community Development Division. And I'm managing the process for developing a set of values, vision, and high-level goals as part of setting a foundation for the 2050 Regional Development Guide and the constituent policy plans. So the graphic that you see here just kind of illustrates our general process. What we're really doing at the beginning, we're doing a lot of reflection and engagement among various groups such as LUAC, MOSAC, the council, our various stakeholder groups to where we are as a region, what new issues we're facing. Over the years, I know it's been a tough couple of years for our society and our region in general. And so a lot of that is part and parcel of that conversation. We will be drafting language for the council's consideration through the balance of this year. We will be engaging various groups and the public at large to get their input. This will set a foundation, but it won't be set in stone. It will be meant to guide the planning and policy development that will follow in subsequent years. And there will be opportunities through the continuing planning process to, we may learn new things, we may begin to articulate things in maybe perhaps a slightly different way or frame things. So we will revisit this language based on that experience too. So there's a little bit of a feedback process for that. Okay, I got the clicker in front of me. So, what we're trying to accomplish is to create a vision that creates a mental picture of the desired future. We want a vision to be, for the region to be inspirational and relatively unambiguous. And again, we want to set the stage, set a general direction for plan and policy development. I think we've all seen vision statements or values that might seem naive or lack clarity of purpose. And we want to create a vision statement that sets a good foundation for the plan and policy development to follow, plans that can be implemented in service of that vision. So when we talk with our partners and as we reflect on our planning processes prior to now, we want to create we want to define a set of shared terms that we haven't always defined consistently across plans. So we want to make sure that some of this work, that we move from the general to the specific, that the values and vision set the foundation, and that the goals, objective, policies, and strategies that follow are consistent with and implement that vision in a more or less clear way. And if we discover over time that our strategies are not as effective as we want, we can think about course correcting or revisiting the goals that we have. So somewhat of a simplified version of what we're thinking. You would expect that as we proceed through the process, you might see something that branches, where we might have strategies that may be in service of multiple regional goals, for example, but we were kind of starting with this sort of basic concept. So again, over the past year and a half, we've been having conversations internally and with our groups around a set of 10 exploratory issues. This is not a proposal for a structure, but it's just a way to kind of hang ideas off of, explore issues, and see if these ideas and concepts resonate with people and what issues come up. So we had shared with you as part of the survey and I appreciate those who have contributed to that survey. I'll share some of those ideas with you today and encourage you to talk further about that. And for LUAC members who haven't done that, we'll keep the survey open, and this will be part of the record. We will be documenting and synthesizing and sharing that information with the council and with other groups, so that that information is shared across our planning process. So we wanted to take a little bit of time with you today to give you an opportunity to reflect on further and discuss amongst yourselves. I know the group here isn't super large, so I'm certainly open to coming back again for a similar engagement process. We will more likely be a little further down the path, so we may come back to you with something that's a little bit more concrete. But one of the things we're doing is, as I mentioned, we're defining these terms, and so how we define values are as core beliefs that we share about what is intrinsically important or desirable. So some of the things that we heard from you.
Hold on a second. Jerry, did you have a question?
Oh, sorry, Jerry.
What do you mean by equity?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. So equity was an important foundational principle in our current regional development guide, Thrive MSP 2040. When we think about equity, we think about the issues that we might have regionally in terms of racial disparities. We think about discrimination, we think about access to opportunity, we think about accessibility in terms of accessibility to the transportation system and to economic. That is something that we think requires actually greater clarity of what we mean by equity. And so that actually is often a discussion point that we have, so that we are clear on that term, because the word equity gets used a lot, and we're not always certain what we mean by it. So that's an area of focus for us, definitely. Our region has, in terms of racial disparities, the difference between, say, the income and wealth of our Black residents and white residents, for example, is profoundly different compared to the rest of the country. So that's an area of exploration in terms of planning and implementation. So let me share a few of the values that came from the survey, and then open it up for any additional thoughts that you might have. Diversity as a strength was seen as a value. The importance of safe and welcoming communities. That people should have a strong sense of belonging in the region. The value of open-mindedness and the value of creativity. So, one of the things I'd like to hear from you, especially in terms of your role as an advisory body in terms of land use, is how we think about when our values in terms of the dimensions of land use, land development, land stewardship, and the different ways we think about land throughout the region and its different uses. So just pause there and see if you have anything to add. Love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Gary, did you want to go first?
Well, since I missed the beginning, am I thinking that this is from the 2050 comp plan, people that met for that, and so that's what this is.
Yep. All of this is about providing language that will be part of the 2050 Regional Development Guide. Yes.
Okay.
Carl, did you have something?
Well, in our community, I don't think we're unique. The land uses have been assigned based on the comp plan. We have a comp plan that says you can put houses here, and commercial here, and mixed commercial here, and all those different kind of things. So they're kind of in place, and there's been evolution over. Every comp plan has been modified a little bit based on the infrastructure available. Where I think the developing communities struggle, and our biggest challenge is that development is fully funded by the developer for all practical purposes. All the infrastructure, the sewer, the water, and all those kind of things for any new stuff, that's funded by the developer. And if there's most communities, ours for one, is not particularly excited about investing in that infrastructure when we've always had we're doing like the more mature cities are struggling to replace their infrastructure. Hey, we're replacing infrastructure too. So we have some of those same issues, but nowhere near to the extent where we're looking at 100-year-old stuff. So land use is basically a function of the market and what people, right now people want to build apartments. And at what point in time we're going to be overbuilt, but there's also very strong feelings about how many apartments we need in our community. And then how we balance and try and come up with, you know, we've made a commitment to try and have so many achievable, attainable housing units, and trying to do that within the framework without, quite frankly, the city writing a check. We work closely with the county, we had a couple of developments. So that's probably our biggest challenge because the cost of development is horrendous. Worse than the cost of a new car. When I saw the Jeep ad the other day and the marketing, it's only $89,000. This old guy's first house was $39,900, the second was $60,000, and the third was $164,000. So there's a perspective there that if a Jeep, which is worth half its value in 6 or 7 years, costs $89,000, and with what's going on with the construction industry and the costs and those kind of things, where does the money come from to achieve all those wonderful little bullet points?
Appreciate that. Anyone else?
Well, I was on that 2050 committee there, and the one thing that I noticed, nobody seemed to want to talk about politics or inflation, how it's going to affect practically, it'll affect every facet of your lives. No, Carl, right, you're right. How long ago was that Jeep probably going for 40, you see? So cars have doubled, houses have doubled, everything is doubling. And so how are you gonna try to predict what's gonna happen in 2050? I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, I'm not gonna try to gamble, but and how the Met Council is gonna try to decide on what to do today, it's gonna affect 30 years from now. Good luck. But it was very interesting, and I don't know much more I can say about it. Everything is gonna change. Our life, 30 years from now, it will not be the same as it is now. I don't think in any which way. Cost of energy, cost of everything, so much more people are gonna have to work from home because you can't build 94. Thought it would take 94 to come over here. There's nothing but a parking lot all the way from Highway 100. And so roads aren't the answer, you know, so so every one of those you know, items up there you have are very important, and they all have their own little story.
Indeed. Indeed.
An example of the political challenges. We had a recent proposal which came through, it was recommended for passed by the Planning Commission with a couple no votes, went to the council, it's failed, it required a land use change, because part of it was commercial. And there's a discomfort in saying, hey, we only have X amount of commercial in our community, do we want to give up what we have? And the location of this is, it was kind of dicey, there's a wetland in the middle, and it could be taken either way. Well, it took lawsuits, several months, going back and forth and changing a bunch of stuff to ultimately the project is getting done. It's been scaled back and it's lost, and that project would have provided like 20% of our achievable affordable units, which that of course got scaled down because we didn't want to give up the commercial, but that's the political side of it where there's some strong feelings that we need to protect the commercial that we have because it was on an interstate and some of those kind of things. So, you know, transit-oriented development and all those kind of things, they're trying to find a way to massage that stuff in there. But once again, it was way different when it ended than when it started. And it was the politics that changed it.
Should I proceed? Okay. I will proceed. And again, I appreciate all these different ideas and, you know, reactions. It's helpful, especially to know how you might want to be engaged in the future. So a second exercise and part of the survey was to kind of what might be parts of a vision that you or your communities or you think the region might have for the future, and we define a vision as a more or less idealized future. I kind of like to frame it as what could we achieve if we had kind of all hands on deck, not given what we know about what our challenges and opportunities might be. To respond to Jerry's comment about the difficulty in predicting what it'd be like in 2050, I have a full appreciation for that. I think one of the things that we've recognized, especially with the pandemic, in politics and the globalization, is that we are in a much more uncertain path in the future, and so we are actually undertaking a process of scenario planning, which you may hear about at some point in the future. Understand if economic forces or issues head us in one direction, will we be prepared to adjust to go in that particular direction? Whether we might experience greater challenges as a society or economically or facing issues related to climate change or that kind of thing. So I do want to, again, I want to share some of the ideas that we heard from LUAC members in the survey. Speaking related to equity, one of the ideas was that racial and gender disparities are eliminated. That's as part of the vision, that wealth is more evenly distributed. One that was that infrastructure is maintained and upgraded, and that the last one that I'll share with you is that the region is a center for innovation and ingenuity, which I thought was particularly interested because I do believe the region is, and I think it's certainly appropriate that we would call that out, keeping that quality of our region. So, as LUAC members and responsibility for kind of considering and advising us on land use, I'd like to hear your thoughts about, given that the region does have a range of types of places, from agricultural uses to areas that are preserved in their natural environment, range to large urban centers and everything in between. What are the things that, how do you think the future might look? How might people experience it as part of our a vision? What's different or new or maintained as part of that vision? Yeah.
Well, I can tell you about Carver County.
Please.
I lived in Carver County all my life, except the first 2 years of my life. I lived here in St. Paul, actually. So Carver County was always a rural farming county, but now it's the fastest growing county in the state. And so if you're gonna put in housing developments and everything, where's it gonna go? On farmland. So you can clearly see how farmland in Carver County is diminishing yearly. Towns like, Chaska and Victoria and Maconia are just mushrooming. And so they annex land from the townships, which are generally rural and farmland. So clearly, there's gonna be less farmers close to the city in the 7-county metro area, more housing, which brings in all kinds of problems. You gotta have more roads, more infrastructure, more police, more fire, more schools. And so you can clearly see how Carver County is gonna be affected by the growth and things like climate. Climate is certainly changing. Certainly it's trending hotter and drier, but when you do get storms, they're more fierce and heavier. So that's washouts and damage and everything else. So clearly, life in the future is I think really that our life is gonna change drastically. It has to. You can't do things the way we've been doing, so. And how do you build roads? I mean, where are you gonna get the money to keep building roads and roads and roads? And so we have to, our life is gonna have to change somehow. We're gonna have to more work from home, maybe order things out, so we have a few cars on the road delivering. I don't know all the answers, but clearly that's how I see it coming, you know.
Sure.
Mayor?
Yeah, I'd say vision, at a real high level, generally vision statements. We are connected to the Midwest. It's a wonderful resource for growing food research. And when you look at that public health and how you take that knowledge, and we're looking down the road 30 years from now and embracing the outdoors as a region. I think, we're known for that, but I think it's should be articulated also. And knowing that technology is changing the way we work, it's great opportunities also to rethink that whole infrastructure thing. People live and travel, and the way we were 20 years ago in vision is not where we're at today. So it's great opportunities, I think, to sell a message to our communities and region and state also. Even your comments, Met Council is a 7-county region, but we are a large state, and we should be developing in the 7-county metro where we've made those infrastructure investments. And yes, you do lose some farmland, but it makes more sense to keep that concentrated development in your urban core and not plow up Northfield and the other towns and skip segments. So it's good, strong, regional planning on infrastructure and roads that, you might have to change some thinking based on what we learned in COVID and DoorDash and everything else that's popping in. And, even you look at drone technology, hey, 5 years from now, it's out there now. You don't need a car to deliver something anymore also. So exciting times.
I will add that I think you're starting to articulate some of our strengths and opportunities for the future, and you mentioned the need to articulate some of that. We will certainly provide data and research to support, from a land use perspective, how, our vision in terms of how we, how to maintain those strengths and to realize those opportunities over time. As you mentioned, we have a strong economic competitive advantage around food science and agriculture, and so I'd fully expect that to be articulated and maintaining that competitive advantage over time. We have good partnerships with greater MSP, and so we have pretty good relationship with organizations that can help us articulate that.
We're running way over time on this.
Yeah, I can wrap up.
I just have one question. For those of you that work for the Met Council here, I don't know how long you guys been employed, but how accurate was, say, back in 1990 was your 30-year conflict for 2020? Let's say, how accurate was it? How accurate did it turn out back?
I think it was spot on, right? I think it was 100% accurate.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. No,
Remarkable, actually.
Forecasts or household,
Yeah,
or
I mean,
what's the question?
I would say our forecasts are pretty accurate, I wouldn't say accurate, but pretty close to what we were expecting over time. So if you look back at 1990, what the council was forecasting for growth and development at a kind of regional scale, when we were hitting, 2010 and 2020, yep, that's where we were at. Within a reasonable margin of error. And even when we look back at older plans, we see that, some of the original ideas for where transit lines might be, where growth might be, where our economic centers, our core business and job centers within the region are, even as far back as 1968, the joint plan that was done with all of the metropolitan agencies at the time when we weren't all combined, a lot of those things persist for a long time because they're of such value to the region. As Mayor Drosty was noting, they're a strength for the region. But even the visions for where some of those connections should be made, where transit lines might link up some of those job centers, are some of the things we're starting to realize today and have seen be built now over time, because it does take, unfortunately, decades to build some of these things too.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think the only thing I've added, I think it's, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
For a developing community, in Lakeville, the classic example, it's been an evolution. In the early 90s, we had a couple growth task force and went through this exercise of trying to figure out how do we get from where we are to where we need to be. And one of the things that was determined then is at that time we were building some very affordable housing. And what came from that is that the affordable housing didn't pay enough taxes to support the services it required, both the school district and that. We also had a lot of big terrain issues as far as the buildable lots and that type of thing. And so we were building our infrastructure, so we pushed for large lots to try and protect the trees and the environment, more ponding and all those kind of things. That's also evolved over that period of time, where the standards kept going up and up and up as far as rainwater and how all those things are managed. So, but then now the evolution, we don't really have, for all practice, we have a few large lots, but most everything is the smaller lots. We're building lots of 60 and 70 foot frontages, which for Lakeville, if you'd said that was gonna have 25 when you were on planning commission, never gonna, I'm not even planning or, it never would happen. It was just, the smallest lots we were building were 85 foot for various different reasons, and most of them were not. So that's been an evolution, and then so each, we kind of nick away, but you still have to have enough money to fund the development of the infrastructure and people that can afford to pay the price in their housing for that infrastructure. So without heavy subsidies, it's very difficult to meet that affordable.
Right. Madam Chair, we can end now.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Appreciate it. We had just one more slide on goals, and I think the real focus was on values and vision, so I appreciate your input.
Okay. So next up is Raya with her.
Yes. And Greg can pull up the other presentation.
Community designations. So we're waiting for Greg to pull that up.
I think I upset the apple cart there with
One of the biggest challenges, get this off, I cannot talk with this thing.
Me too.
One of the biggest challenges as far as our regional vision going forward is there's a sizable number of people in the region now that don't appreciate what we have and don't want it to stay. The burn it down if we don't get our way contingent of people. And, if we don't learn from what happened on Lake Street, nobody can invest in our region and know that their investment is gonna bear fruit, I think a lot of people thought, oh, well, insurance will take care of it. We're finding out that no, people were drastically underinsured, and I don't know what it's gonna take to get that back again. Because I would like to live in a place where everybody values where we are and wants it to be a nice place, but how do we?
First, you have to eliminate road rage. If you can eliminate road rage and look in each other in the eye and say, please and thank you, that would solve 90% of our problems.
Okay, community designations.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Thank you for being here. And we're going to be talking about community designations, as you have heard about them in your previous two other meetings. So just kind of an overview of what the project is, just a reminder of the importance of the community designations and what we're trying to achieve throughout this process. Community designations help further the regional policy through creating groupings of communities with similarities between them so that we can advance regional policies at the local level. So the land use policies and density expectations are developed based on community designations, and it's a way to distinguish the differences and uniqueness of communities. And also, as well as setting the direction of growth in areas that have urban infrastructure and trying to protect agricultural areas and also areas with natural resources. In our process so far, so the process of this project is that we are working with you and some other stakeholders, including committees such as MOSAC, as well as Committee of the Whole, but we also have focus groups, both internal staff and external. And we are analyzing the previous round of community designations, trying to refine that information, making sure that we make it better this time and we capture all the comments and any additional information that's needed to be included in the community designations process and project. It's an iterative process, so it's analysis, engagement, kind of going back and forth. The timeline of the project is that we started at the beginning of this year by coming to, or going to, the CDC and also LUAC in January. And our hope is that in this iterative process that we are able to bring a final draft of community designation to LUAC by September or maybe November, and then being able to, for LUAC to be able to make that recommendation to CDC before the end of the year, and then the CDC and the council adopt community designations by the end of the year. The deliverables of this project is that a set of criteria for community designation. So those are the variables that you may have heard. There were 5 of them in Thrive MSP 2040. We will have the proposed community designations for all the communities in the Twin Cities Metro, the 7-county Metro. A description of what each of those community designations are, density expectations associated with each of those designations, as well as a set of maps and data that describe those designations. Okay. So as I mentioned, we have pulled together an external focus group of local staff. This is a map trying to show where those areas are. We try to, we solicited kind of the time from the local staff to help us with this. Some of them we recruited individually, some of them we just, we put a call out and asked them to help us with this project. So we try to make sure that we have a good representation of a geographic representation of the different areas in the metro. So we have staff from different cities, as well as both Carver and Scott counties, since they have land use authority. And we do have one person from a consultant firm who worked on the Dakota County Collaborative Plan to make sure that we have that perspective from the areas that, well, more rural areas and more agricultural areas in that area. And we also have an internal focus group. That's a focus group of staff at the Metropolitan Council. In the internal focus group, we're trying to capture the expertise of our in-house expertise in different areas that includes land use, transportation, regional parks, wastewater, surface water, water supply, transit, housing, trans-oriented development, equity, and research. These are all the units that have representatives in this internal focus group, both talking about what we have learned from the previous round, but also the direction of the policies of the regional policies of the council and how we can better implement them in the next round. There we go. So what we have heard so far, we tried to summarize that here, so sorry about all the words on the PowerPoint. What we have heard in between the 2 meetings that we've had with LUAC, both in January and March, was basically refinement of some of the information that we currently have, including infrastructure condition, to strengthen the one variable that is supposed to represent that, that's age of housing. Exploring soil conditions and trying to refine the other variable that we have, which is percent developed, and that represents areas that are practically developable. To include information about climate and sustainability, to use the planned land use information that we have in terms of the pattern of land uses as well as density. And also taking a look at population and employment stability in the Twin Cities region. From the external focus group, and you'll see how we have kind of heard similar things from all of the groups. In the external focus group, we've heard, again, refine developable areas, and some of the information that they've provided and how to refine that is to consider what are the areas that are economically feasible to be developed, consider issues related to water supply and what limits development in areas, as well as natural resources, areas that we would like to preserve, so we don't want development to happen there. We also heard from them to coordinate, if possible, coordinate efforts upfront, similar to how we do that with our regional forecast, regional and local forecast that we publish, as well as considering compact development policies in areas not just associated with one community designation, but expand those. Consider more flexibility within each community designation, and explore access to transit and employment as potential variables. Internally, we again talked about refinement of developable areas. Some of the ways to do that was potentially thinking about redevelopment capacity, whether or not we can consider housing quality as one of the factors for developable areas, and environmental consideration, which includes some of the climate data that we have. Again, the use of planned land use database for both density and potentially housing type, because one of the things that we had previously heard was not being, in the previous round, not having captured the development types too well necessarily, like there are areas that we can improve on. So housing type is coming out that way. Thinking about how we can preserve natural resources, and as well as using transit market areas. And one thing that has come out is the special features. If you remember, there's a set of values, or not values, there's a set of data sets, if you will, or variables that were included in Thrive as special features. So better define those special features, their use, and how we can potentially incorporate them better in the definitions.
So Raya,
Yes, sorry, I'll stop.
Carl has to leave in 10 minutes.
Oh, okay,
So
sorry.
I'm gonna give him a chance if he has any thoughts on the community designations to empty his brain onto us.
I mean, kind of the drum I've been beating, where each development community is developed based on its unique characteristics. So it's very difficult to apply, say, we're gonna have grid housing and this, because we have all the environmental constraints and the economic constraints and where the infrastructure is, and building in a manner to where you're not leapfrogging around the community. All those things are what guide the development in our community. And we kept adjusting to try and better address the concerns raised through the Met Council and our different planning actions. So it has, I said earlier, it's been an evolution. It will continue to evolve, but it's not going to change in our community. We can't change where the environmental challenges are. We can't change where the current transportation infrastructure is. So everything is designed with that in mind. We're fortunate in our community where we've got Cedar Avenue, we've got some county roads, we've got a major grid transportation system, but we are still very auto-centric because all of our commercial development is in nodules also throughout the community. And that's the way that particular community was envisioned, and it worked well because of the infrastructure that we have, the infrastructure that we built, and we can still come up with residential neighborhoods that have curvilinear streets and all the things that people want. The people that want single-family homes, they don't want a racetrack through the community. So we've been able to do that to a fairly good extent, I think it's safe to say. Not perfect, But, you know, it's not this flat piece of paper, so it's important that whatever considerations are given, it's not a table. It's a whole bunch of potholes, a whole bunch of elevations, and a whole bunch of things that people consider important, whether it's existing trees or some of those kind of things. Now, trees have a life expectancy too, which is the other problem. People come in, well, you can't take out all those trees. Well, when the next tornado comes in, or they're 100 years old and they're dead on the inside already, you know, they have a life cycle just like people do. So we have to work with that within our community, and now we're also developing some fillers, the stuff that may have had an existing home on it and a barn on it, but it's only like 10 acres or 8 acres, a third of it is wetland. So we have to be very creative how we tie that into. We've already looked at that with ghost flaps and stuff as the adjacent stuff developed. How do we serve this property? So it's a very intimate kind of one area at a time, but you have to look at the entire area, but you also have to look at these little spots. And that's what we try and do. I think that's all I can really say. And most, I think, efficient communities are doing that. So start hanging some of these other labels, which sound really good, but they're not necessarily practical because of the economics of it. Not saying that we shouldn't develop affordable housing, do everything we can, but the affordability factor is also, you know, the environmental laws that we have for housing standards. And my first house in Lakeville had 2x4 walls, my next one had 2x6 walls. And that wouldn't meet today's environmental standards. So every time we ratchet up some of those other, you know, things to save energy, it drives the cost of housing. And then the push a couple of years ago is sprinkler single-family homes. I mean, it's nuts. Number one, it's a whole other maintenance thing, but those are the kind of things that, if anything, we need to protect against. Because you get these little groups that want to manipulate the world for their own benefit sometimes.
But
Feel better now?
I was fine, but I mean, it's like, sometimes in a developing community, you know, we get pointed at, like, oh, you're building all these big fancy houses, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Well, you know, it's the nature of the land. I mean, I'm in a large lot cul-de-sac that was built in '97, and it was a model at the time. The property behind me was all unsewered stuff on 2.5 acre lots. Well, then, now that's been redeveloped, and they added sewer and water, but they had to manipulate everything so that some of these lots would have been flag lots, which we hate, and all those things were designed that way, but try and pay for the sewer and water that they wanted. Well, some people solved that problem because they came in and bought 3 or 4 lots and built McMansions on them. So that's not affordable housing, but everything behind me that's gone in has been $1 million plus $1.5 million on taking out properties where the house is worth $30,000, $35,000, $350,000. So when you have a treed lot that's oversized, that has some things, that's not going to develop as multifamily, especially in the middle of a residential area. It's just not realistic. The location of where the land is in relation to the transportation infrastructure also dictates what type of use you put there. You know, we have the whole commercial, medium density or high density, medium density, single family, that kind of that pecking order, part of the design standards as old as the hills. We still end up with single family homes on Cedar Avenue. And they're selling, which makes no sense to me.
My house is a single-family home on Cedar.
Right, with the fence and a setback and a berm, and
Yeah.
enough trees for 6 houses.
Yeah,
So,
and the lot was cheap, which is why I bought it, but, yeah,
so, but then once again, that was developed, what, 35 years?
30,
Huh?
30 years ago.
30 years ago? So since then, of course, the berms and the fences, and I think the fence line has been changed once already,
Yep, fence has been rebuilt.
you know, and trees, all those things that were put in when it was basically naked land, all that infrastructure that was required at the time that we designed into the project now makes her house, her property, a really nice spot. But it's not going to happen when you first develop it because you got these sticks of trees and all that kind of stuff. So you have to be patient with the other stuff.
Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to make it worth your while to drive all the way down here.
Well, I wasn't really holding my breath.
Thank you, really appreciate it.
We were on planning commission together, and she abused me totally all the time. And I'm pretty sensitive. But it worked really well, and we had a long-term relationship. And then she got on council and abused me even more. So there's an affection and appreciation for the relationship that we've built over the years. So she kind of set me up here. I'm blaming you.
That's great. Well, thank you. Really appreciate it for your comments. And
Because the reality of, in a perfect world, I think we're talking about the perfect world for the other kind of stuff, it ain't there. We want world peace, you know, how's that working for us? So we have to be pragmatic at what we actually have to work with.
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Neighbor?
Yes.
So, just a quick update for you to tell you where we are with the variables. So currently we're working on refining some of the existing variables. Basically, so we're thinking about the variable that was previously called percent developed. We're working on what's called the development cycle at the moment. So basically, we're refining the percent developed and what land is available, where communities are in their development cycle. So we are trying to refine that by adding additional information, making sure that we capture a fuller picture of the communities, as well as thinking about density slightly differently. So not just intersection density, which is also correlated with other data, such as some of the climate data that we have with the heat map, but also planned housing density and job density. So we are looking into seeing the correlation between those pieces of information.
So on
Yes.
the land, the percent developed and land availability, are you looking at what people are actually willing to redevelop within a community?
We are, well, I guess we are trying to capture as much as we can based on what can be developed. And I think that I don't know if we will be able to capture some local pieces of information based on different local ordinances and different communities, but is that what we're trying to get at? Or?
Well, not necessarily that, but like Farmington went and talked to all of their people that have big parcels of land to see, are you actually willing to develop it in what time frame? And what would you like it to be so that they know that if they plan for it to develop, it actually will develop rather than sitting there and being a hurdle for everybody around it to have to work their infrastructure around. And like, we keep thinking that Apple Valley is gonna redevelop the Times Square commercial area, which is a pit. But it cash flows, so the owners don't wanna develop it anytime that I can see, you know? So to the extent that we can get that information from communities to know what actually can be redeveloped or developed, you know, if you have a community that it says it's urban, but everybody's happy the way they are and nobody wants to redevelop, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Okay.
And if I could
Add to that too, Councilmember Wolf, the points you were making are really related to the capacity that we use when we're starting to look at the ability to support forecasted growth and what the forecast should be. In the development of the 2040 community designations, we zoomed out at a much higher level of just looking at land availability, so subtracting out, kind of similar to our illustrative long-term sewer service area. If we were going to expand what is not already limited by other regulations, minus the wetlands, minus this, minus things not in ag preserves, minus ag preserves, I should say, not in the opposite. So at a much higher level, and say kind of what remains left within the jurisdictions at a super high level, But yes, when we get to forecast and actually allocating forecast, then we go much more granular into that level of detail.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the clarification, Lisa. And I know some of that information has previously come out through the local comp plan review process where the community is getting into those very granular local level efforts, and then they're telling us this actually doesn't jive very well, and the community designations have been modified accordingly in the past. Okay, so where was I? Oh. We are looking into refining the age of infrastructure data, which at the moment is just age of housing as a proximity. That has proven to be slightly more difficult, that the data isn't necessarily available, but we are still looking into seeing what other data is available to refine that piece of information. The Metropolitan Urban Service Area and the Long-Term Service Area are two pieces of information that we are keeping as is in terms of variables for community designations. Then we have talked about additional variables, like what else can we add, not just what can we refine from what's there. We have talked about climate and what data is available related to that. So we have the land surface temperature, but that is also correlated with other data. As I was mentioning, intersection density is one of those that they just like the maps kind of, they light up in the same areas basically. As well as localized flooding, which we are still reviewing, but at the moment, based on the information, it seems like it may not be as useful because it is everywhere, basically. This does not differentiate communities very well. The natural resources, so this is like thinking about natural habitats, thinking about surface water, groundwater, and also prime agricultural soils. So those are information that we are considering in how it interacts with the rest of the variables, and are they correlated? Do they say anything valuable, basically, that makes sense for them to be included to help us, again, differentiate communities or see the similarities better. So that is this whole exercise of community designations.
You were
yes.
mentioning before the geography and soil types, like we put a wastewater treatment plant in East Bethel and the pipes sink.
Right. Yeah.
So that's another variable that we're.
So we're talking about like both agricultural soils in terms of, so in case of prime agricultural soils as areas that we would like to preserve.
Right.
And in case of condition of soils is areas that are not developable. So yes, we're like, we're trying to use that data to help us refine the land availability, basically saying, well, that can't really happen the way that we thought.
Okay.
We are thinking or looking into proximity to transit services, and that's still under exploration at the moment, and whether or not that would help us with community designation or will hinder that in the long run. As well as thinking about whether or not any data related, like any demographic data, makes sense to include in community designations. Because so far, the community designations are a geography-based component. All the data that you have seen is about built environment. So what's the role of demographic data basically in here? So we're exploring that. One thing that I would like to mention before we go into the questions that we have for you is related to the special features that were included in Thrive. There was a separate chapter called Special Features. These are features that were considered, some of them were considered in the community designations analysis, and in the way that they're included in Thrive is that they are meant to
refine community designations and in terms of policies. So where are all these areas kind of falling? What does that mean for the local community, where the educational institutions are, or where job concentrations are? They're not included in the community designation analysis. Now, we are thinking about, does it make sense to include some of these potentially in the community designation analysis? But a bigger picture, how can these be used better? How can they be more prominent potentially so that they are more valuable moving forward? Okay, but what the questions that we have for you, we have 6 questions. They're printed here, so maybe it will be a little more helpful. They're on this page. We were gonna do a small group discussion. We're gonna do one small group discussion.
Yeah, because that's all we have is one
Yes.
small group.
Andy, yeah. There's extras for anyone who wants them. Oh, sorry. There you go. Okay, so there are a few questions that we have for you that I would like to just focus on, maybe spend a few minutes on each of them and get your feedback on it. So the first question is, given the surface water, groundwater interaction areas, given that they can have great impacts on developable land, so like areas that should remain as pervious, areas that are in better condition to be developed and things like that, should they be considered as a variable? Is it our first question for you? And we have gathered some information from MOSAC as well. Now, we didn't pose this specific question to them, but we did talk about values related to water supply for community designation. So we have basically gathered the importance of water supply to be considered in community designations and capacity for development as it relates to water supply. But bringing that question to you, do you have any specific feedback on as it relates to surface water, groundwater interaction?
I'd say absolutely.
Yeah.
So are you talking about like fens and stuff, or what are you talking about?
I'm sorry.
Are fens, like the savage fen, or what kind of interaction?
I think we were talking about such as groundwater recharge areas,
Okay,
like areas that, again, need to be left undeveloped or need to be left with certain cover, like land cover, in order to better support the actual developments that are happening elsewhere, less flooding potentially.
Or like, we have a large part of our city, Umar Park, 150 feet of sand down to the water bedrock. So I remember the university, must have been about 18 years ago, and they had consultants out of Germany. And our engineer, WSP at that time, we were putting in $20 million outfall pipe to the river, and he thought we were absolutely crazy. He said, here's the glacial trends of the sand, why would you be piping everything out to the river? It does not make sense. So I agree with them totally. And how you line catch basins. Now the public wants to see water, but it doesn't infiltrate very well when you line them with clay. So how to utilize leverage when you have certain topographies, soils, I think you should have as much info to the community as you can.
I'm not sure if it raises to the level of the community designation as much as portions of communities, depending on where because most cities aren't the same all the way across.
Right.
Correct. Especially when you look at natural resources, rivers and whatever, wetlands.
Do you have something, Jerry?
Well, water is one of the biggest things you have to have as a variable. I mean, my goodness, just look at the southwest United States. They're always drying out. I mean, how long is it gonna be before there's absolutely no drinking water down there? One more year maybe? When you read how the reservoirs are drying. So how are 50 million people gonna survive without water? So clearly Minnesota, if nothing else, it has lots of water, which in the future is gonna mean everything. You see, so Minnesota stands to inherit a whole lot of stuff in the future because it's water, so yes, very much valuable, very much. Both underground and surface water, because actually, it's the underground waters comes from the surface water. That's what I read. Our aquifers are replenished by swamps, mostly is what I read. Water filters down through swamps, so if you're gonna put in housing developments, don't touch the swamps. And don't touch the water areas, build around the, this idea they give out 1 for 1 or something, so you can take out a water area if you make another one. Well, nature built that for a reason. The soil and the geography of it, that's why it's a groundwater thing. So leave it alone, period.
The one thing to consider is, again, like, and as you mentioned, to Councilmember Wolf about whether they're like isolated in certain areas and not community-wide, so that's a piece of information that can potentially not necessarily play a huge role in the community designation, but something similar to special features if we figure out what to do with those.
Well, like even in terms of protecting agricultural land, you can allow some development where it's wetlands and trees and stuff, let some large lots go in there so you can get, because some people wanna have a big yard, really, really big yard. So if they're gonna have one, don't put it on good agricultural land or in really sensitive water areas, but in places where the soil's not great, but there's a lot of wetlands, you can get a dirt road in there or a small road to people's houses, but we can't plan that for urban development because so kind of getting the best thing for each place, because right now some of the large lot stuff goes on places that were farmland, and that's really dumb,
Does the Met Council have any, or discussions on maybe eliminating non-sewer lots out of the urban area as you go forward?
We have not talked about
Okay,
that.
Lisa.
We're in the beginning of our policy conversation, so if that is something that the council would like to discuss, if we're getting feedback from the region that this is something we need to consider, then that's something we'll consider.
Well,
right?
and I know it's controversial, but I think ultimately it's best. As long as you're treating sewage, you don't have a lot of the groundwater issues that we end up having as we expand out to these rural areas, and especially with the DNR and federal standards. I find it ironic every time I sell a house, no matter how old the septic is, they gotta put a mound because the rules have changed in distance from water. So I mean, from a policy looking out 50 years, I know some people want large lots now until they get a little older or the economy falls and then there's no market for them. So looking out 30 years, I think it is a policy issue maybe that could have some discussion, not saying it should be edicted.
It's certainly something that we investigate as we look at the prevalence of private septic across the region in relationship especially to some soil conditions in different areas, or where we've seen continual requests to connect failing systems. That does have an impact on our regional system too. So those are the things that we definitely are looking at and and we'll be sharing, this is what we've learned that you should know about.
Well, and Sam Water too, Coates is a good example, they're all contaminated, they all have nitrates, high A, and with the changing standards, you gotta get on these systems and get away from wells. Almost automatic in the urban. As we're looking out, I think some of these at a high level policy issue might be desirable to put language in there that the intent is to remove all independent wells.
Well, and we have some data on well contamination for private wells right now. We should be considering that in the land use designations too, because a city can clean up water from a well, treating it, it costs money, but it's
Well,
done. But,
manage, well, cities is the only way you manage it, it's hard to do it on individual.
but for individuals, if you do drill down and what you get is bad, we should know that before they try to build the house and drill the well rather than after.
Any other thoughts before we move on to the second question? Oh, I don't know. I thought I need to go through the slide. So our second question is, what characteristics of job density impacts communities in different or similar ways? Basically, how might job density differentiate communities? Like, what characteristics impact them in similar way or different ways?
Are you talking about industrial areas that would attract a lot of workers, you mean? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
High employment versus.
I'm sorry?
Job density, high employment opportunities, lower, just different varieties of that concentration of jobs.
I think it's unknown, manufacturing, you're automating because you can't afford or find the employees, and I use Egan, Thomson Reuters, they got a vacant building there, so because of COVID, all of a sudden, you know, it was a rich transit turnaround, we had buses going in and out, now it's gone. So what's going in there, don't know, could be housing, whatever. So I think stepping back and really rethinking, again, I know the manufacturing side, but it's because of worker shortage. You're doing everything to automate, and robotics that's going into aggressively in the last 10 years, hey, 30 years out, will we have employees on the manufacturing side?
Well, it's not having as much impact as it did. I mean, having the big daytime populations, you have restaurants and all of that, was a big differentiator. But now, so many people are working from home.
Yeah.
And the places that did have those big daytime populations, like downtown Minneapolis, don't have that anymore. So we kind of got to figure out how this COVID stuff is all going to go.
Well, and Carl mentioned that earlier, Lakeville developed and et cetera, but I see communities changing dramatically because they can work from home. That walkability becomes more important than ever. So, you know, how, and not that I don't want to get in my car, because I don't care where you go, when you're around a community where things are walkable, people love it because of that specific issue. So to figure out, in a sense, even the suburbs, how do you put the density and that walkability and the integration of changing zonings that give you that type of output that doesn't take all the traffic or roads and catch basins, et cetera.
And in many cases, we're kind of, like, we're not necessarily, we don't have all the data to be able to capture work from home. Job density comes from the employer saying how many employees they have, and they all go into that location, even if they're not physically there. So
Yeah.
can
have
So,
that.
so it's bad data and it's not differentiating as much anymore as it used to, is that what you're saying?
Or it can prove that that is the area that has the potential for now redevelopment, right? Because
Yeah.
because there's a lot of vacancy, for example. That could be another way to look at it, so.
Well, and we're likely to see a lot of the office space in downtown being converted to apartments or condos or whatever, because they gotta do something with it. It's too valuable to just leave empty.
Seen that happen in St. Paul already with a cycle,
Yeah.
with a lot of new housing coming in too. And at the same time, I just read in the paper about a new office development going in downtown Minneapolis, like 29 stories or something. Like, really interesting.
I saw that too, and I was like, are you nuts?
But we'll see.
But a lot of stuff gets proposed that maybe doesn't actually happen either.
So what do you see on transit when it changes from office to residential? The transit need, I'm assuming, disappears, because if I'm living down here, I'm looking at the walkability, it's not the ride to go somewhere.
Or it could increase because now you have residents that are permanently there, not just during certain hours of the day. Therefore, their need for transportation, their pattern of traveling is different than.
I'd be curious, the data there, just,
And the reason that they're using transit changes too. So they have shorter trips, maybe they're going to the grocery store as opposed to going to the office.
Yeah.
So the reason changes as well.
And I don't know, Jake, if you have something to add. I know you used to work in St. Paul, and probably downtown is a really great example of sort of that switch in transit around that too. I mean, I remember, it was kind of, I don't remember, but several decades ago when state agencies moved out of downtown, that left a lot of vacancy here. And when I started working at the council, there was really limited, it really was just commuter transit coming in and out of downtown St. Paul. It's obviously COVID's had an impact on our transit routes and regular routes, but prior to COVID, there was a lot more daytime travel. I would head to the airport pretty regularly in the middle of the day on a regular route bus service, right? Instead of having to take something else. And of course, the trips between Minneapolis and St. Paul are all day long, all the time. But I don't know, Jake, if you have other things you'd add to from your experience.
I was gonna add two things now, I guess. So yes, as people's need to travel large distances diminish, often their shorter trips become transit dependent instead of being in the car. So even if someone was to drive here from Lakeville to work, then they may use transit or car share or, both cities just work together to implement a huge electric vehicle network in order to minimize single vehicle occupancy. So I think that's definitely a factor as we look to the central cities. I was gonna bring something up about, the past use of transit in the metro, up until the 1940s when we had streetcar lines that did serve those purposes of short-term trips. So you could live in Hopkins and you could take the train to Minneapolis to have fun, or you could take it out to Excelsior also to have fun, because there used to be that amusement park out there, right? And you could also go to 6 or 7 grocery stores just on that streetcar. So I think that's kind of, we're shifting, just like a couple of you have said, people like to stay where they are. Once they have a walkable community, they like to stay in the community, they don't need to go somewhere else. I think we're seeing that shift back towards shorter transit trips, transit that's a little more accessible generally. And when you have enough transit, you don't have to worry about, if you have a disability or you have no access to a car for whatever reason, now you've got another way to get around without a bicycle. I think is kind of how I think about it. So, we sort of stopped one kind of pattern of development in 1940, and then just sort of did our thing, and then when the council, I would say in that long arc of history, right, when the council became established, then we're gradually moving back towards that sort of walkable neighborhood thing. And I'm also really curious, Raya, for us to think about how the last significant downturn in the middle of the last planning cycle impacted housing development because places like Dakota County saw tons of influence and influx of American Reinvestment and Recovery Act dollars because there were so many foreclosures because people weren't able to maintain or stay in those large lot houses that cost a lot of money, and that's something that we haven't really talked about. That might be something to consider.
Well, a lot of them got snapped up because when COVID hit, people who didn't have to be close to work and wanted to be someplace not so people-y bought those. But one of the things that happened was, there were a lot of townhome lots that weren't getting developed that then got replatted as single family to use up the lots. Now we're seeing big townhome developments again, but townhomes just went away basically for 6-8 years at least.
I have two things that come to my mind on this. One, I have a nephew that used to work downtown St. Paul. Now he's been home, works out of his house, and he wouldn't have it any other way. He said, when he looks back at driving rush hour traffic, find a place to park, walk in, walk out. He wouldn't have it any other way. So clearly that's gonna impact communities. Let's say the retail stores down here, if the workers aren't coming down here to work, then retail stores aren't selling nothing. Now, I walk this, whatever you call it, over to that parking thing. There's retail things all along, and they're always closed when I come here, and I think, how come they're closed at 4 o'clock? Is that because all the businesses are closed in there, or? So anyway, that clearly has an impact on communities. And another thing, if you got a large manufacturing plant, you're gonna attract workers, of course. And so workers may stop at the liquor stores, grab supper somewhere, whatever, so that impacts communities. But if that manufacturing didn't keep up with things or whatever, for whatever reason was out of business, and then all the stores that came there to, because of the workers, if that plant is closed, then that affects the retail, obviously, too. So, that's just kind of some of my thoughts, I guess.
I mean, obviously, there are some jobs that you have to work in person,
Yeah,
you know.
manufacturing.
You can't outsource your doctor to, well, some people did for a while, but that doesn't go very well long term. But I think there's a much looser connection between employment and where you live. People are choosing where to live based on other factors besides how far it is to work. That, you're looking more at, is the community, do I like it here? Do I have friends here? The school's what I want and stuff, where there were a lot of people who were picking where to live best based on what their commute was to get to work. And that's much looser now than it was.
One thing that I would say about job density and job concentration is that even if people aren't necessarily coming there as much, that employer still exists and can shape the community in a different way. So that's still, maybe job density isn't the thing that in terms of people, but job concentration in terms of employers is something that I feel like we can't ignore.
Yeah, industry versus job.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, industry versus job. That's a nice way of putting it.
And the synergy that goes along with being co-located with other similar kind of businesses that have whatever the things that you need for what you're doing or whatever.
Okay. So I'm looking at time. There are a few of these that I think are a little more important, and maybe I should have done the order
Okay, well,
slightly differently. Yes. I'm gonna go to what you have as question number 5 first. Is it feasible to have multiple designations within the urban areas, considering potential future policy impacts? So currently, areas that are within MUSA, like if a community is fully within MUSA, they only have one community designation. If part of the community is outside of MUSA, then they will have more than one. In some cases, they may have, I think, 3. But those are rural designation, not urban ones. We have talked about this a little bit, and just wanting to get your feedback on that and whether or not it's feasible to have that within the urban areas. Thinking about the implications, like policy implications that could have, if you have half of your community designated as one thing and the other half as something else. Now, that is partially also thinking about some communities being very different from their east side to their west side. And then one community designation kind of responding to the entirety of that geography.
I agree with multiple designations, depending on how much you're developing.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't hear.
I agree, multiple designations depending on how much you're developed.
If there's a big difference between different parts of the city, it makes sense to have the designation reflect that, to me.
It's somewhat the way I look at it also.
Yeah, I do too. Makes sense.
The one thing that we would need to consider is minimum density requirements associated with community designations. And if, like, we don't wanna like get into the local planning realm, right? Like telling that you have to build at a certain density in this half of your community versus the upper half. So that's just something.
Or do we?
Or do we? Yeah.
The policy
I guess it depends on water and sewer availability. If the infrastructure is there, I don't see any problem with saying this is where we have the infrastructure to support higher density development or not. But if it's not, I would want to say build a bunch more where we've got to put in a $25 million pipe.
I think tying in development, if you have split, it should always be contiguous with the developed area as you move. It shouldn't be, however you put the language. For the communities, and I'm guessing it's not a large number when you look at metropolitan area, is it?
That would be split?
That would be split multiple.
A lot of Washington County, I think, would end up being split.
It also depends on what level you're looking at it, like if, we would have to take a look at the, this modeling analysis piece, because so far some of the information is at block group level, so they do light up differently, but then when you put like 5 different variables together, then it's hard to say how they would split up.
And I'm guessing traditionally, when you're not identifying the uniquenesses of communities, that's where you get into conflict here, per se. You have no idea.
And I guess it would kind of depend on how it plays out. We'd have to see what it looks like, and if southwest Minneapolis is fundamentally different from downtown, clearly, and I'm okay with reflecting that. But if it doesn't make a big difference when you put everything together, then maybe we don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Collect data, future decision.
Good point.
And, okay, yes, thank you. I keep reaching for this,
Yeah.
forgetting that we're all on the same slide. So I briefly mentioned the special features. We had talked about them at a previous meeting as well. How can, in your mind, how can they be better utilized? And should we continue working with them like that separately? Like if there's a special features, then there's variables within community designations. But how can they be better, implemented or taken advantage of in the next round? Because in this round, we're not really sure whether or not they were used as they were intended.
You guys have an opinion on that?
I'm all ears.
Well,
Maybe let me
I mean,
rephrase.
special
Do you want-
features, I mean,
Yeah.
by its own wording, seems to me special features can only be used one way or something, I mean, when you talk about special features, are you talking about maybe lowland or hills or lakes? Something where,
Want to go back? Yeah, those things.
They were very specific in Thrive.
well,
And it was, special features is just a title, maybe we just change the title.
okay, all right, that just confused me then,
And
okay.
I think the intention was that these are layers of information that can refine policy. So based on, for example, where the regionally significant ecological resources are, that could help you with your local land use planning, right? But they were not necessarily, they weren't included in the community designation, but they were instead brought out separately on their own to be used as, here's another piece of data that you can incorporate in your policies.
Yeah.
But how can they be better utilized?
So what was your feedback from planners, city staff that were working on it, when you gave them that flexibility?
We haven't asked that question of them yet. We brought that question to you first. But we are going to ask them a similar question regarding the special features and by kind of getting their feedback on what they did with this information locally.
I
I can
think,
report out on that at the next meeting.
I think in large part, the communities know where these things are in their own communities. So they don't necessarily need the map to tell them where they have these things because they're very familiar with their own community. I do know that the council talked about some of these maps over time, figuring out how to score programs or things like that. Looking for planning for freight corridors and all of that kind of stuff. It gets used where it's relevant at a regional level, but I think at a local level, you know where your ecologically sensitive areas are, you know where your stations areas are for future transit ways and all of that. It's already built into the plans because they know those things,
So
if that makes sense.
Councilmember
That
Wolf, would
makes
you
sense.
say that was a useful, having special features, in your experience, was that, having been here in the last cycle too, was that helpful in policy development? I know we used it, I'm thinking especially about, land use policies around station areas, for example, so we were able to show that, but, I'd love to hear from, I think Mayor Drasty, I think you were on LUAC at the time as well when we were going through this process last time. So you might have some recollection about why we were considering some of these larger, kind of cross-jurisdictional features that didn't seem to be concentrated in one type of community, but were transcending those boundaries in some ways. But still we're sort of organizing
features that were influencing or driving change in a community. Was that a useful tool in the last cycle of policy development?
I didn't hear a lot of pushback from staff, so I'm assuming it was, as we went through. You know, when you hear squabbling, but to identify things in the plan, it's only wise that we do that, because people change also, and I just find it fascinating, we get new council members, and why don't we do this? Well, we've been doing it for 20 years. You haven't been engaged, and if you don't have it in a document, you can't show them and explain and educate.
I find them very, very useful when the whole council is talking about any of these specific topics or things that relate, because then you can put it up and everybody can see how different parts of the region have that issue. I don't think we did a good enough job of going with the water supply considerations. That one kind of fell flat on its face, and we just have
I
been.
think our timing was totally off on that, but yes.
Well, and I said the same thing to the ES staff. I'm like, you know, we should tell cities, this is where we've got extra pipe space if you want to increase your density, rather than tell us where the density is going to go and then we'll build very expensive pipes in urban areas, you know.
Well, clearly cities and metro areas, not my area of expertise. I mean, being a country boy, like the mayor here, of course, he's very knowledgeable about cities and so.
I'm a farm boy.
So, but it seems to me that government, with all its zoning and ordinances and everything else, that they must seem to take a lot of time to plan out things. So I think they would probably use existing conditions wisely, I would guess. I don't think a city council would want to go on record as kind of doing one dumb thing after another or something when it comes to things like that, so.
Yes, they did, they weren't going to tell anybody.
Yeah, if they want to run for reelection, I don't think they would do that. So I think they tend to do a pretty good job, I would guess, researching and getting input into matters like that, you know.
As I mentioned, when we bring this up to the local planners as well, I can let you know what their feedback was and how they use this information, or how we can make sure that it is more useful than it was in the last round for them. I'm not 100% sure how necessarily they used it in the different areas of the region. To some it may have been more helpful than others, depending. Any other points before I ask the other question? Okay. So this is question number 4 on the sheet that I would like to bring out, and that's about demographic information. As I mentioned, in the currently the variables that we're using, they're all related to built environment, and they don't necessarily incorporate any specific information that is just related to demographics, because that's kind of taken care of in the forecast model separately. However, at the same time, this has come up whether or not people or information, the demographic information shows that differentiation and similarities between communities. So how might that information potentially be considered in distinguishing communities? Or do you have concerns related to potentially including such information? Or would you like to urge us to do one way or another?
Well, from my point of view, they all look the same to me. Now, I mean, when you look at it from country in, places like Burnsville, Lakeville, Rosemount, Savage, they all seem the same to me. There's retail here and there's housing all around, and so from my perspective, they all look alike. So I don't know how one would distinguish themselves over another. And the cities here they all seem the same. You got metropolitan areas downtown and businesses here or there, and then you got housing all around and everything. So from my perspective, it all looks the same. So I probably wouldn't I'd probably the last person you'd ask about any ways to fix those kind of things. I don't know. I mean, that's just
Well-
my perspective on the matter, you know. So I don't come into I'm in downtown St. Paul. I went to the hockey games years ago for concerts years ago, but I haven't been downtown since I came to this, and so I'm certainly no expert on downtown. So anyway, it depends on, I think, where you live. If you live out in the country, then everything looks the same to you from the country perspective like that.
But I'd say how it's changed, the census data, we were 8% people of color 20 years ago, we're 21 today. And 30 years from now, we're gonna be drastically different in those cultures, understand it. People working from home was 17%, now part of it could have been part of the COVID at the time. But I mean, huge numbers of shifts just in that raw data. And what does that mean to housing, and what does it mean to, hey, things are changing. And age has a lot to do with it too. Millennials are fine with the 70-foot lot, 50-foot lot, there's no issue. But, you know, years ago, that'd be the end of the world. So again, you gotta think the culture and diverse nature and work with all kinds of people. You don't need big spaces like we Americans traditionally always have thought through things. So, and the last thing I'll say, if you go around the world, cultures, we're the only ones with single-family homes and big spaces to live. Everyone else, almost worldwide, is in multi-housing of some type.
Because we're the only ones that can afford them.
Well, we have big land, a big space, but it also put into perspective, we don't do something on the oil or $5 gas and $6, it's going to change everyone's habits also. So, it's a great time to think, and we're talking 30 years. This has just changed.
I lived in Germany for 3 years, and I did some work in Switzerland too, and people wanted to have single-family homes, but a one-bedroom apartment was like $3,000 a month, so it just wasn't gonna work out. But the challenge with doing that is that the demographics are always changing. How do you say something's gonna be long-term when, I mean, even, you know, you have a community like, you know, Richfield was all old people. And then they either died or moved into senior housing, and so young families came in again, you know? I mean, it's not something that you can point as being consistent over a long period of time, because people are always moving and being born and dying, and you know what I mean?
That's where we need good, strong data. We got about 8 years of baby boomers moving out, and then they're gone, all aged out. And you look at the millennials and have good data for cities and councils, so you can educate them, get them comfortable, and make sure you're proactive, not reactive. And I'd say in many ways, we're reactive even in our housing based on the changes in supply we have.
We're always looking at the demographic data, and we get regular updates on census information and whatnot, but in terms of differentiating communities, I don't know that the demographics are consistent enough to work. I mean, what have you guys been hearing from other people?
We heard similar comment to what you brought up, Councilmember Wolf, in terms of it being like changing and like not being stable enough for or not being able to tell how it goes into the future. So there are concerns about, like similar concerns that were brought up about this point. And also, like basically how the normal changes. And as you mentioned, Mayor, that, you know, we have, our demographic composition has changed so drastically, and what does that really mean? And so both of those.
Yeah, it's a tough issue on land use and taking the data as it, you know, what is the element that you'd want to track and incorporate in those designations? It's hard.
I think that, sorry, can I interrupt?
Yeah, we're informal here in
Okay.
case you hadn't noticed.
Yeah, I was just wondering. I think one of the considerations, because a lot of this analysis is all based on the built environment, right? Like 98% of it is. But the built environment is influenced by people. And so how do you accommodate that in the conversation that we're having around community designations so that we are still planning for people, acknowledging the existing built environment and planning for like the future built environment, recognizing commonalities and differences in the same way that we're trying to look at with water supply and in the same way that we're trying to look at with some of our other data factors. So how do you incorporate the conversation or the implications of people in the built environment as we're thinking about community designations? I think it's a worthwhile exercise to just like think through that. Maybe it's not showing, it won't end up showing up in the final data, you know, but I think acknowledging that people really impact the built environment too, and we obviously have the built environment for the purpose of people existing within it, to really think about that aspect of it too, the human-centered approach.
Well, I think housing size is one demographic thing that's relatively stable. It changes over time, but it's not doing this for the most part. I mean, and that's one that kind of gives you an idea. Do you have big families, people living alone? Do you need schools? You know, that sort of thing.
Councilmember, when you said housing size, you meant the
Household
size?
Yes.
Okay.
Which I'm guessing the last 30 years is continuing to trend down.
It certainly has, and then there's been a bit up as well, especially in some communities in the metro.
Especially those communities that have, what do I wanna call them?
Multi-generational?
Well, yes, but the desirable school districts. So if you look at Lakeville's population shift, in terms of demographics, Lakeville is, in some cases, some schools are more diverse than nearer to the metro schools as far as population, because there's so much interest in attending schools in Lakeville. And they have houses that can accommodate multi-generational families. So that might be, maybe that's how we could think about that kind of demographic thing. And also, you can get number of bedrooms, right, from the census data as well. So that might be something.
Should be in our parcel data set too.
Yeah. Okay, well, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip that one other question that I had. It was about prime agricultural land. Maybe, does
I
anyone have
think
any?
we captured that a
I
little
think
bit
we
too.
did, yeah, we talked about that. Okay, so just kind of giving you what the next steps are. So we will be finalizing the variables based on the correlation of these variables together, just like saying, seeing whether or not some information is already captured through one variable compared to the other. And then we will be putting them together and bring you some options for the groupings of these variables, so those clusters that you will see, so that we can consider the impacts of each option on future and local regional policy. So our hope is that at the next meeting, you will see some maps with some groups of communities, and based on like each variable. Like if you add this variable, this is what it would look like, and that kind of information.
So will that be at the next meeting that
yes.
we get that?
Yes. At least some of the variables, we're hoping we can bring maybe all of them, but we'll see. We're working on it at the moment.
I'm assuming that's gonna be the whole meeting then, because that's a lot of stuff.
Yes. That's all the information that I have for you. Do you have any questions or concerns, comments?
We should probably send an email out to other members that couldn't be here for a variety of reasons today, so that we can get input from a fuller cross-section.
So we can send some information